ladies. How are you all today? Good. I'm actually got sick this week, so I'm going to put this right back here so in case I need it, so when I can't talk, then it's there. And I have a little secret. I actually had a nicely planned, very outlined talk that I was going to share, and as I got sick this week and just stuff in my life came up, it just became a little reality check to me that I needed to come in here with a little bit more of that feminine essence that you heard her talk about in the beginning, and not so much of that masculine forward motion essence. And actually, I'm a group fitness instructor, so I didn't know if you guys, and I teach Zumba, I didn't know if you guys wanted to get up and just do a little quick Zumba with me. Are you guys up for that? Yeah. All right, okay, everybody up. This will help me relax, and it'll help you guys get flow, and so you can actually sit for another 20 minutes and listen to me ramble. So how about a little merengue? Does anybody know merengue? Yeah, it's basically a march, okay? So you're just gonna start marching, all right? Now, to look Spanish, to look that Latino flavor, you just add the hips, all right? How simple is that, right? You keep your knees bent, right? Okay. Now you wanna take it forward and back, forward and back. And this was totally not supposed to be part of the talk, but that's okay, we're going with the flow. And back. Then you can take it side, side. Just like that, good. Now, wash your windows. Now you got the whole body going. It's hard to do this with a mic. I'm used to having the strapped on one. All right, you guys look fabulous. Are you getting this on the recorder? You guys got to see yourself afterwards. Awesome. Okay, you can go ahead and sit down. You guys got a little blood flowing. I love that. I am starting a business. I'm trying to birth a business right now called Practice Joy, How to Become an Embodied Soul. And I was hoping that this weekend would really be the birth of my business. However, like I said, some stuff came up this week, and I am still a work in art. I am still in the process of learning how to become that embodied soul. And I have so much that I want to share with you ladies, but I want it to be about you today. I really want this to be what you want to hear. So I'm going to kind of throw a few things out there and just see how you react. If you want to raise your hands, if that's what you want to hear, and then we'll go from there. So I can talk about women's history, if that's interested. Maybe we'll take a survey at the end. So we can talk about women's history. We can talk about how we moved from more of a matrilineal line to patriarchy, and how, playing on what Johanna and Dr. Amy said, how that actually is a theory that has led me to believe, an explanation, if you will, that really explains how we get to be in diseased states, and how our relationships get to be in diseased states, and how we get to have so much violence in our society today. So we can go that route, or we can talk more about how when we separate ourselves because of patriarchy, that really separates us both internally and from each other, and from what I would call nature, Mother Earth. So I don't know if any of those topics are really of interest to you, but how about the patriarchy one? Does anybody want to go for that one? Okay, and the history of women? Yeah, okay. And the other one, well, so I'm just going to talk and we'll just see what happens, and we'll just kind of go with the flow. But basically, I woke up about 4 years ago, now not literally, but metaphorically. I woke up to the realization that I was an emotionally stunted adult. I was 31 years old, but I had a toolbox of about a 9-year-old. And that presented a little bit of a problem, considering I had 2 young kids myself that I had just birthed, and a relationship that was in dire need of help. And so this led me to start studying about abusive relationships, to give you a little kind of clue of what I was in. And this, in a long process, led me down a path to start studying gender roles, and what our society says are typical gender roles, right? The women are the nurturers, the caregivers, the ones that stay at home and forfeit the career, versus the men that go out and kind of slay the dragon for us. They're the ones that are the Prince Charmings, and they're always rescuing us. And this continued to lead me down a path to eventually study that women's history that we're talking that I mentioned, and to start learning that we actually didn't always live in a society that was dictated by these gender roles that we see nowadays, and that these gender roles really they add to this frustration and the confusion that we feel like we're not worthy, and that we can't really own ourselves, like what Johanna was talking about, that we feel like we don't deserve that love. And when I started to see all of this play out, and it was really through a book that I read called The Creation of Patriarchy. Highly recommend that everybody reads it. It's a pretty scholarly book. It's written by Gerda Lerner, who is a historian. But it really showed me what was kind of the underlying, what she calls preconceived notions in our society that we probably are mostly invisible to. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to describe what those notions are and then maybe apply them to my life to help you see them. And then what I really encourage you to do, though, is kind of what Johanna was talking about, is that we are all saying the same thing. A lot of what Johanna was saying was what I was going to say. So it kind of takes that off of my plate, which is nice. But I want you to use me as a reflection of you. And how do you see yourself in me? Because I think a lot of times we look at somebody and we're like, oh yeah, that's cool, or oh, I would never do that, or, but there's that little saying that says something that you see in somebody else that kind of annoys you is usually a reflection back to you. So use that as you hear this story. So Gerda Lerner in her book talks about how we moved from this very nomadic, more of a matrilineal tribal community that was seen as, and we don't know for sure, but it was seen as something that was more peaceful. And it was something that was more amiable and more in connection with nature. So if you think about Native American traditions, that's kind of where I think about what we were like. This is really the history coming out of old Europe. So that's that area, and it's combined with the ancient Near East in that area. And as we moved into an agricultural society, something happened. We saw that we needed more manpower to work the fields, as well as more children to pass the wealth off to that the fields were producing. And this is where the creation of patriarchy actually got its start. And it didn't get its start by men. Because if you remember, I just said that it was a matrilineal tribes. So what does that mean? Women were the initiators, much to their dismay. And this is just a theory, we do not know for sure. But women were actually most likely the initiators of the ones that started negotiating the reproductive services of other women. Eventually, men learned to take this role over, and when they did, they learned that if they could control half of their own population, the women, they most likely could control other tribes that they were taking over. Instead of just slaughtering them, they started to take them as slaves, and that's how slavery was born. And this happened over thousands of years. It didn't happen overnight, but it happened over thousands of years. Eventually, right about the time this was all cementing, was something else very important in our human history that was happening. Can anybody guess? No. It was the written word was starting to come into play. So back in Sumer, the cuneiform, and in Egypt, the hieroglyphics, which was all art, which I think is a fascinating study, a little side note, just to learn more about language and how it's really an art form. It's not necessarily something that should be taken so concrete like we do in our society, but written word was starting to come into play. And with the written word, the education system started to come into play. And with the education system, something else started to come into play, which was the laws. And the laws actually became what we saw as history. Now, just because something was written into law didn't necessarily mean that that's what was happening. And that's important to note because if you guys know ancient Near East laws, what's one thing that was written into laws about women? Can anybody guess? The men. Yeah, they basically had, it's not that they didn't have any rights, but that their sexuality and reproductive services were given to the men in their lives. But by writing them into the laws, they were actually written and given over to the state. And do we not still see that today? That our reproduction services aren't necessarily our own, but that they're really belonging to the state. And again, if you remember, this was because of agriculture, because of the system that they were creating. So our reproductive services, we just got rights to that back in 1970 something, right? So this is one effect that still is in play with the creation of patriarchy. And some of the other things, again, the history got written. But what Gerda Lerner goes on to explain is some of these preconceived notions, which, again, help me to understand where we've gotten into our society. And they build on each other, and then I've kind of taken a little bit of leeway and put in my own understanding from my own experience and from my own recovery programs that I've been part of. And just, I love to think and process things and see how I can see the symbolism in things. Her first preconceived notion was this, that women's bodies were not their own. And I would go on as far as to say that they weren't even the men's in their lives, but they belonged to the state. And a lot of times in those states, they were run by very hierarchical type of religious institutions. And so this religious institution now owns the rights to our sexuality. And I believe that this gets passed on to even the men in our society. So we do not know this. We think we're the owners of our bodies, but really nowadays we have this system telling us that you're not the rightful owner to your body. And this leads to a second preconceived notion, which is that men become the norm in our society, and that women become the deviant, the one that's not the norm. And when this happens, I think it leads us to this third preconceived notion, which is that the masculine, taking it out of our bodies and putting it into those two essences that we talk about a lot of times, the feminine and the masculine. And just to give you some other words so you don't get caught on semantics, I don't want you to think about genders when I mention those two words. They really are the consciousness, which is the masculine. Sorry, I was hoping to have my hands free so you could see this picture. It's the consciousness and the unconsciousness or subconsciousness. Awareness is masculine. Not awareness would be considered a feminine essence. Very penetrating presence is masculine. Free-flowing cyclical cycles of death and rebirth is the feminine. Think about our monthly cycles. The banks of the river, the power of the water. Strength versus power. Okay, so these are the two different essences of the masculine and the feminine, but this is what the ancients have called it, and so it's in our language and we don't even realize it. And what these two essences really want to do is they want to have sex. They want to come together in sexual union and have that intimacy. That's a picture of what somebody might call God or the divine. It's the God and the goddess coming together. And that's what wants to happen inside of each of us, because we each carry that masculine and feminine energy. And it's what wants to happen in all of nature. David Dieta is another name I'll throw out there. He explains this probably much better than I do. And it gave me a really great picture of how these two essences play out in our world all around us. And that's why sex is so fascinating to us, because it's the physical embodiment of this spiritual world that's happening around us. And what Gerda Lerner goes back to, going back to her study with patriarchy, is that it teaches us that there's now not this, but this. That instead of coming together in that sexual union and that goodness, that oneness, it becomes a battle of sexes. It becomes submission to the one on top. And what have we prized? We've prized the masculine. Not just men. This is not to give men a bad name, because I believe that they're affected by this as well. But we've prized our brains over our bodies. We've prized this consciousness, this light, and we're so afraid of ever looking at the darkness inside of us, because we think darkness is bad, we think it's sinful, or we think it's profane, and it's not. It's just really another side of the coin that we need to be able to see the full picture. So hopefully you're able to track that a little bit. I know this is some really deep thought, and it takes a lot, I think, to wrap your mind around it. But these are the preconceived notions that Gerda Lerner talks about in her book, that when I look at the world as it lays today, I can really understand why no one feels like we have the right to be able to own our own souls, to feel the right that we deserve love. And it has to come from here first. Why we have such a hard time connecting with other people. I have so much more I want to share. This is going so fast. Okay. So let me try to wrap this up a little bit. So the reason that I feel like I've been able to finally pick up that deed to my own soul was because I started learning women's history and learning that we didn't always live in this patriarchal society, and learning that I couldn't wait on men to justify me. I come from a born-again Christian evangelical world where I was waiting for men to justify me so that I could go to seminary and become a pastor. I was waiting for them to say that, yes, she has that right as a woman. And I started reading different books and just realizing that I can't wait on them. It has to come from me. And I think it goes back to the fact that we were the initiators of this system of patriarchy. We have to realize that we have the individual power to pick that deed up to our sexuality, and to realize it doesn't belong to the state, it doesn't belong to our religious institutions, it doesn't belong to the men, it belongs to us. And when we do that, we can start to be integrated souls again, start to become embodied souls, and we can start to feel and not be afraid of the power that we have as women. And not to be afraid to call men to be the banks, to be the strength that we need to help guide us and give us the direction that we need as that free-flowing river. A river without banks is a flood, right? So we need that masculine, but we need it actually inside of us too. We need to do this again, not this, even within our own souls. So to bring this all back, I look at abuse in a very different way now. And again, this was my starting point, trying to understand abusive relationships and why they happen and why the gender roles are the way they are. And I really think we abuse without even knowing it. I would say I was guilty of abuse in my own marriage as well, because I wasn't an integrated soul. Because I didn't prioritize my body, I shamed it. And I felt the repercussions in postpartum depression and anxiety, and with the weight gain, and a multitude of other things. And it really wasn't until I picked up the book and started to learn that the first representation of the divine was a goddess, and that women's bodies at one time were honored and appreciated and seen as good and the source of life and creativity and vitality and sensuality, that the snake wasn't the devil. The snake represented the underworld, which again, if you remember what the feminine essence is, the snake is just the darkness. The snake is that kundalini essence of women that is powerful and unknown. We don't know what's going to happen to it. It's not the devil, it's just another side of that coin. And when I when I started to pick all this up, that's kind of where practice joy started to come into fruition. And practice joy really is nothing more than me teaching how to do this process. It's teaching how to learn to sit in those feminine feelings that we're so scared of, that darkness that we're so scared of, to learn that it's okay to listen to the body and let her speak to you and let her emotions come full force. And they're powerful, and they can be scary and intimidating to a world where we're so used to living in our head that it feels a little out of body experience. I've felt it, it's a little frightening. But at the same time, when you start learning to learn to your body, you start getting reconnected to the mother of all of us. You start digging in deep to your roots, your kind of like your umbilical cord of life, to the planet Earth, and that connects each of us. So that's the first step of practice joy, learning to sit in those feelings. The second step is learning to back those feelings up towards the masculine side. 1 minute, okay, I'm gonna wrap this up. So you learn to back those feelings up to the masculine side, which is your thoughts, that consciousness. And once you're up in that masculine side, then you can start to use that consciousness and see, do those thoughts benefit me today? They might have benefited me yesterday, they might have benefited me 30 seconds ago, but are they benefiting me right now? And if not, what can I do to change those thoughts? How can I enlarge them, rephrase them, make them work for me? And when you do all of those steps, real simple, feelings first, thinking second, rephrasing third, you'll start to do that interval process, and you'll be able to bring whatever gifts that you have, whatever story you have, and touch people in the way that only you can. And we need that from women today. Thank you so much.